Sometimes the smallest moment in a quiet coffee shop reveals more about people than a lifetime of success ever could. The rain had started before sunrise, a soft gray curtain drifting across the streets of downtown Seattle, turning the sidewalks slick and reflective like dark glass. Inside a narrow neighborhood coffee shop on Pine Street, the smell of roasted beans hung warm in the air, while the low hum of an espresso machine filled the quiet spaces between conversations. Most of the customers that morning were regulars, construction workers grabbing something hot before the job site, office employees scrolling through emails, a couple of college students hunched over laptops near the window. The door opened, and a woman stepped inside, brushing a few drops of rain from the shoulders of her coat. Claire Whitmore paused just long enough to look around the room, her eyes calm but tired, the kind of tired that came from too many late nights and too many decisions that affected thousands of people she would never meet. Today she wore no designer labels that anyone could recognize, just a simple navy coat and low heels, her dark hair tied back in a loose knot that had started to fall apart in the damp morning air. To the people behind the counter, she looked like just another stranger walking in from the rain. The barista glanced at her once and then again, his expression tightening slightly before he leaned closer to the manager beside him. A quiet exchange of words followed, the kind customers rarely noticed unless they were paying attention. Claire stepped forward when it was her turn in line and offered a polite smile, the kind that expected nothing more than a cup of coffee and a few quiet minutes before the long day ahead. But the manager didn't return the smile. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his eyes lingering in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like suspicion. Around the shop, the small routines of the morning continued without interruption, chairs scraping softly against the floor, spoons tapping ceramic mugs, rain tapping gently against the windows. Then the manager cleared his throat and said something that shifted the air in the room just enough for people nearby to notice. A couple of customers glanced up. Claire's smile faded, not into anger, not even into embarrassment, but into a calm stillness that suggested she had experienced moments like this before. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there for a second longer than most people would have, as if deciding whether the situation deserved any more of her time. At a small table near the corner window, a man with grease-stained hands and a worn brown jacket quietly watched the scene unfold while his young daughter swung her legs beneath the chair, unaware that the next few minutes would give her a lesson about people she would remember for the rest of her life. The manager folded his arms across his chest, as if the decision had already been made long before Claire Whitmore stepped through the door that morning. His voice was not loud, but it carried far enough for the people closest to the counter to hear every word. He said they were not serving her today and suggested she might want to try another place down the street. The words were polite on the surface, yet something about the tone made the room grow just a little quieter. Claire did not immediately respond. She simply stood there with the calm posture of someone used to rooms full of pressure, boardrooms where every sentence could move millions of dollars. Yet here the stakes were strangely smaller and somehow more personal. She glanced once at the menu above the counter as if reminding herself that she had only come in for a cup of coffee before a long morning of meetings that were already waiting somewhere across the city. A few customers shifted in their seats, unsure whether they should pretend nothing unusual was happening or acknowledge the uncomfortable pause hanging in the air. Near the window, Marcus Reed watched without speaking. His hands were wrapped around a paper cup that had long since stopped steaming. The dark grease stains on the edges of his knuckles told the story of a mechanic who had already been awake for hours before the city lights faded with the sunrise. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter Lila swung her legs under the table while carefully peeling the wrapper from a small blueberry muffin. She had not noticed the tension at the counter yet. Children often focused on the small joys directly in front of them. Marcus, however, had noticed everything. He had noticed the hesitation in the manager's voice and the quick glances from the barista. He had noticed the quiet patience in the woman standing at the counter. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply listened the way someone listens when they already know the outcome of the conversation. Lila finally looked up when the room grew a little too still. She followed her father's gaze toward the counter and whispered in a voice just loud enough for him to hear, asking why the lady could not order coffee like everyone else. Marcus did not answer right away. Instead, he watched the woman reach slowly into her coat pocket, as if preparing to leave without another word. Something about that moment sat wrong with him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, or maybe it was the simple fact that his daughter was watching and learning how adults treated strangers when no one believed it mattered. Marcus set his cup down on the table with a soft tap. The sound was small but steady, like a decision finally settling into place. He wiped his hands against a folded shop rag that hung from his jacket pocket, stood up from his chair, and walked toward the counter with the slow, unhurried steps of a man who had no interest in making a scene, but every intention of doing what he believed was right. Marcus stopped a few feet from the counter, close enough to see the faint tension in the manager's shoulders, but far enough to keep the moment calm. The rain outside continued tapping softly against the tall front windows, and the espresso machine released a quiet hiss of steam that drifted through the air like a slow breath. Claire Whitmore had already begun to turn away, her hand still resting near the pocket of her coat, as though she had accepted the end of the conversation. She carried herself with the composed stillness of someone who had spent years learning how to walk away from situations that were not worth the energy of a fight. Marcus noticed that calm. It was not pride, and it was not defeat. It was simply patience. He cleared his throat gently, not loud enough to draw attention from the entire shop, just enough for the manager and the woman at the counter to look in his direction. When he spoke, his voice was steady and low, the voice of a man used to early mornings and long workdays. He said that if the problem was a table, she could take his. The manager blinked once as if the suggestion had not crossed his mind. Marcus gestured toward the small table by the window where Lila was now watching with wide, curious eyes. He explained that he and his daughter were almost finished anyway, and that there was no reason for someone to leave a warm place on a rainy morning just because the room was crowded. The words were simple. There was no challenge in them. No accusation, only the quiet practicality of someone offering a solution. For a moment no one moved. A few customers pretended to return to their phones, while clearly listening to every second of the exchange. Claire looked at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and caution, as if she was measuring whether the kindness was genuine or simply another misunderstanding waiting to happen. Marcus did not rush the moment. He slipped a few folded dollar bills and several coins onto the counter beside the register, and said that he would also cover her coffee while he was there. The small pile of change made a light metallic sound against the wood surface. It was not much money, but it was enough for a cup of coffee. Claire noticed the coins before she noticed anything else. They were the kind people carried when every dollar mattered, the kind gathered from truck cup holders and jacket pockets at the end of long weeks. Something in her expression softened slightly, though she did not speak yet. Behind Marcus, Lila had climbed halfway out of her chair, watching her father with the bright attention children reserve for moments when adults do something unexpected. The manager glanced between the three of them, and then finally nodded, the tension in his posture loosening just enough to allow the situation to move forward. Marcus picked up his coffee cup again and turned toward the table near the window, as if the matter was already settled. He did not ask the woman her name, and he did not ask what had happened before he walked in. All he had done was make space at a small table on a rainy Seattle morning. But in that quiet gesture the atmosphere of the entire shop shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Marcus returned to the small table near the window as though nothing unusual had happened, lifting his paper cup again while the quiet rhythm of the shop slowly resumed around him. Lila leaned forward in her chair with open curiosity, the way children often study moments that feel important even if they do not fully understand why. Claire hesitated near the counter for a second longer, glancing down at the modest pile of coins Marcus had placed beside the register. The barista had already begun preparing the coffee, the familiar sound of grinding beans and steaming milk filling the space between thoughts. When the cup was ready, the manager placed it on the counter without another word. Claire picked it up carefully, feeling the warmth of the paper sleeve against her palms before turning toward the window where Marcus and Lila sat waiting. The walk across the small room was only a few steps, but it carried the quiet weight of something unexpected. Marcus pulled the empty chair slightly away from the table with the toe of his work boot and nodded toward it in a simple invitation. Claire thanked him with a soft voice that carried both politeness and a trace of genuine gratitude. She sat down slowly, setting the cup on the table while a faint trail of steam drifted upward between them. Lila watched the newcomer with bright interest before offering a small smile that had none of the hesitation adults often carried into conversations with strangers. Marcus simply took a sip of his coffee and looked out the rain-spotted window for a moment, as if allowing the space to settle naturally. Outside, cars moved carefully through the wet streets, while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas and heavy coats. Inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapped around the table in a quiet pocket of calm. After a few seconds, Lila tilted her head and asked the woman if she liked coffee with sugar or if she preferred it plain the way her father drank it. The question was simple and direct, spoken with the honesty only a child could manage without worrying about social boundaries. Claire smiled faintly and said she usually drank it plain as well, though sometimes mornings like this made her consider adding sugar just to make the day feel a little easier. Lila seemed satisfied with the answer and returned to the last piece of her blueberry muffin while swinging her feet again beneath the table. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall above the counter, calculating the time before his shift started across town at the repair shop, where engines and transmissions waited for his hands. Still, he did not rush the moment. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm cup, letting the heat settle into her fingers while she studied the father and daughter in front of her. The grease marks on Marcus' hands, the worn edges of his jacket, the easy patience in the way he listened to his child all painted a picture of a life built quietly one day at a time. She realized that he had offered help without knowing anything about her, not her name, not her job, not the fact that an entire corporate boardroom was probably waiting for her arrival that very morning. And somehow that made the kindness feel more genuine than any gesture she had received in years. The quiet warmth around the small table settled into something almost familiar, the kind of calm that appears when strangers realize they do not need to pretend around one another. Claire lifted the cup slowly and took her first sip of the coffee Marcus had paid for with the coins from his pocket. The taste was simple and strong, the kind of coffee made for people who needed energy more than luxury. For a moment, she closed her eyes slightly, letting the warmth reach past the chill of the rainy morning outside. Lila watched her carefully, and then smiled as if she had just confirmed an important detail. She said that her father always said good coffee did not need sugar if it was made right. Marcus gave a small amused breath through his nose, but did not argue with his daughter's confident opinion. Instead, he rested his forearms on the table and looked at Claire with a calm curiosity that carried no pressure. He asked if she was visiting the neighborhood or if she worked somewhere nearby. The question was casual, the kind people ask simply to keep a conversation moving. Claire hesitated for the briefest moment, not because the question was difficult, but because the truthful answer would lead to explanations she was not sure she wanted to give. She finally replied that she had meetings across the city and had only stopped in for a quick coffee before the day started. Marcus nodded once, accepting the explanation without digging deeper. Outside the window, a city bus rolled slowly past the intersection while rainwater streamed along the curb in thin silver lines. Lila finished the last bite of her muffin and wiped the crumbs from her hands with a napkin before turning her attention back to Claire. She asked if Claire liked rainy mornings or sunny ones better. Claire smiled again, this time a little more naturally, and said that she used to prefer sunny mornings, but lately she had started appreciating the quiet of the rain. Lila considered that answer carefully before announcing that rain made the world sound softer. Marcus looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and gentle amusement, clearly used to the thoughtful observations that seemed to arrive in her mind without warning. Claire noticed the way he listened to her, not distracted by his phone or the clock, but fully present in the moment. It struck her how rare that kind of attention had become in her own life. At the far end of the table, Marcus gathered the loose change he had not used and slid it back into his pocket. Claire saw the motion and realized that the coins had likely been part of his own breakfast money that morning. She said quietly that he did not have to buy her coffee. Marcus shrugged slightly and answered with an easy calm that it was just coffee and that sometimes mornings went better when people helped each other out. There was no performance in his voice, no attempt to impress anyone in the room. It was simply the way he saw the world. Claire held the cup a little tighter in her hands as she looked at him and his daughter sitting across the table, and for the first time that morning, she felt the strange sense that this small rainy cafe might be the most honest place she had walked into in a very long time. The gentle rhythm of rain against the windows continued as the morning inside the cafe moved forward, customers coming and going while the quiet corner table remained wrapped in its own calm bubble of conversation. Claire took another sip of the coffee, this time slower, as if she wanted to remember the moment rather than simply pass through it. Across from her, Marcus checked the time again on the old watch around his wrist, the kind of watch that had clearly survived years of work rather than years inside a glass display case. Lila leaned forward with her elbows resting carefully on the edge of the table and studied Claire with open curiosity that had not faded since the moment she sat down. She asked if Claire worked in an office because she looked like someone who worked in an office. Marcus gave a small chuckle at the honesty of the question and apologized gently, but Claire shook her head with a soft smile and said that the question was fair. She explained that she did spend a lot of time in offices and conference rooms, more time than she probably should. Lila nodded thoughtfully, as if she was imagining rows of tall buildings filled with rooms where serious conversations happened all day. Marcus listened quietly, his attention shifting between the conversation and the steady movement of the street outside the window. When Claire lifted the cup again, she noticed the faint grease marks still visible on Marcus' knuckles and the worn stitching along the sleeves of his jacket. The details were small but impossible to ignore. She realized that the coins he had placed on the counter earlier had not been casual spare change, but part of what he had carried with him that morning. The realization settled in her chest with a quiet weight that surprised her. She had spent years around people who could sign contracts worth millions without blinking. Yet the simple gesture of a mechanic buying coffee for a stranger with pocket change felt more sincere than most of those transactions. Marcus noticed her glance toward his hands and wiped them lightly on the rag tucked into his pocket, a habit so natural he did not even think about it anymore. He explained that he worked at a repair shop about 15 minutes away and usually stopped in for coffee before opening the garage. Lila quickly added that her father could fix almost anything with an engine and that customers always trusted him because he never told people to replace things that were not broken. Marcus gave her a look that balanced pride with gentle embarrassment but did not interrupt her praise. Claire listened carefully, feeling the quiet honesty in the way the little girl spoke about her father. It was the kind of respect that could not be purchased or demanded. It had to be earned slowly through years of small consistent actions. Claire lowered her cup to the table again and allowed herself to simply sit there for a moment, absorbing the rare simplicity of the conversation. No one at the table cared about titles or business cards. No one asked about market reports or investment numbers. They were simply three people sharing warmth on a rainy morning. And for a brief moment Claire realized that the calm she felt sitting across from a mechanic and his daughter was something she had not experienced in a very long time. The rain outside had softened into a steady mist by the time the small clock above the counter moved another 10 minutes forward. Inside the cafe, the morning crowd had begun to thin, leaving behind the quiet hum of machines and the low murmur of a few lingering conversations. At the corner table near the window, the calm atmosphere remained unchanged, as if time had slowed slightly around Marcus, Lila, and Claire. Marcus lifted his cup again, but found only a small swallow of coffee left at the bottom. He glanced once more at his watch, knowing the garage would open soon and customers would already be lining up with cars that refused to start or engines that made unfamiliar sounds. Still, he did not rush away. Lila had begun drawing small shapes in the thin layer of fog forming on the window, tracing circles and hearts with the tip of her finger while occasionally looking back at Claire with the bright curiosity that had not faded all morning. Claire watched the child for a moment, the quiet innocence of the gesture pulling a faint smile across her face. It had been years since she had sat at a table where no one expected anything from her except simple conversation. Then a soft vibration broke the calm. The sound came from the phone resting inside Claire's coat pocket. She paused for a second, as if considering whether to ignore it, but the vibration continued with quiet persistence. When she finally slipped the phone out and glanced at the screen, the expression in her eyes shifted almost instantly from calm reflection to focused attention. Marcus noticed the change, but did not lean closer or attempt to read the screen. He simply looked away toward the window, offering the same respectful privacy he might give anyone answering a call at the next table. Claire answered quietly, turning slightly in her chair. The voice on the other end carried urgency, even through the faint sound escaping the speaker. Someone was asking where she was and reminding her that the board meeting had already started. Several executives were waiting. One voice mentioned that the entire leadership team had been in the conference room for almost 20 minutes. Claire listened without interrupting, her fingers resting lightly around the warm coffee cup. Outside the window, a delivery truck rolled slowly past, splashing through shallow puddles along the curb. When the voice finished speaking, Claire replied calmly that she understood and that she would arrive as soon as she could. Her tone was composed, steady, the same tone she might use in a room full of investors and directors. She ended the call and placed the phone back on the table for a moment before slipping it into her coat again. Lila turned from the window and asked if Claire was in trouble for being late. The question was innocent but direct. Claire gave a quiet laugh and said that sometimes important meetings had to wait a little longer than people expected. Marcus raised one eyebrow slightly, but did not comment. Instead, he reached for his jacket and draped it over the back of his chair, preparing himself for the moment when he would have to leave for work. Claire watched the small motion carefully, realizing that the man who had shared his table and his coffee had no idea that the meeting waiting across the city was being held in a building with her name on the top floor. Marcus slipped one arm through the sleeve of his worn jacket and lifted the other side over his shoulder with the easy motion of someone who had repeated the same routine every morning for years. The cafe had grown quieter now, leaving only the low murmur of the espresso machine and the soft tapping of rain against the glass. Lila watched him carefully, sensing the small signals that meant it was almost time for them to leave. She finished tracing one last shape on the fogged window and turned back toward the table. Claire noticed the moment too. She looked at the father and daughter with a thoughtful stillness, the kind that appears when someone realizes a brief encounter is coming to an end before they are quite ready for it. Marcus picked up the empty coffee cup and rolled the rim lightly between his fingers before setting it down again. He glanced toward Claire with the calm expression he had carried all morning. There was no curiosity in his face about the phone call she had received, and no attempt to guess why important people might be waiting for her somewhere across the city. He simply nodded once and said he hoped the rest of her day went a little smoother than the start of it. The words were quiet but sincere, spoken the way someone might offer good weather to a traveler before a long drive. Claire felt something shift inside her at that simple sentence. She had spent years around polished speeches and carefully chosen words, yet this brief kindness carried more honesty than most conversations she heard in boardrooms. Lila slid down from her chair and tugged lightly at her father's sleeve. She asked if they were going to the garage now because she liked watching him fix things when the shop was not busy. Marcus smiled down at her and said they probably had a few engines waiting for them already. Claire watched the exchange with a soft expression, seeing the easy rhythm between them that only comes from years of shared mornings and quiet routines. She realized again that Marcus had never asked who she was. He had not asked what company she worked for or why executives were calling her early in the morning. He had simply made space at his table because someone needed a place to sit. Claire stood slowly from her chair and picked up her coffee cup, now nearly empty. She thanked Marcus again, this time with a tone that carried more weight than simple politeness. Marcus gave a small shrug and answered that it was nothing special. He explained that sometimes people just needed a seat and a warm cup of coffee when the morning started badly. Claire studied his face for a moment as if deciding whether to tell him more about herself, but something about his calm presence suggested that explanations might only complicate. A moment that had been simple from the start. Lila waved cheerfully as she reached for her father's hand, ready to step back into the rainy street outside. Marcus opened the door for his daughter and paused long enough to give Claire a final nod before guiding the little girl onto the wet sidewalk. Claire remained by the window watching them walk away through the mist, the mechanic with grease on his hands and the small child beside him, both unaware that the woman standing behind the glass was the same person whose name waited on the top floor of a tower across the city. The rain had almost stopped by the time Claire Whitmore finally stepped outside the cafe, leaving behind a cool mist that hung gently in the Seattle air. The street smelled faintly of wet pavement and roasted coffee beans drifting from the open shop door behind her. She paused beneath the awning and looked down the sidewalk where Marcus and Lila had disappeared only a few minutes earlier, their figures already swallowed by the quiet movement of the morning city. For a moment she considered calling them back, perhaps offering a proper introduction or explaining who she really was. But something about the simplicity of the encounter held her in place. He had helped her without knowing her name, without expecting anything in return, and part of her understood that revealing everything now might somehow change the meaning of the moment. So instead she walked toward the black sedan waiting at the curb where her driver had just arrived after receiving 3 increasingly urgent calls from the office. The ride across the city took less than 20 minutes, but the atmosphere inside the tall glass building that carried her company name felt entirely different from the calm warmth of the cafe. Executives moved quickly through polished hallways while assistants whispered updates into phones and laptops glowed with charts and reports waiting to be discussed. When Claire stepped into the conference room, the conversation immediately stopped. Every person at the long table turned toward her, some relieved, some impatient, all aware that the meeting could not truly begin until she arrived. She offered a brief apology for the delay and took her seat at the head of the table. The discussion moved forward quickly after that, numbers and projections filling the room with the familiar language of business. Yet through it all, a small part of her mind remained back in that quiet corner table beside a rain-covered window. Several days passed before the memory returned in an unexpected way. Late one afternoon, Claire stepped out of the elevator on the ground floor of the building and noticed a service van parked near the maintenance entrance. A man in a worn brown jacket was standing beside an open panel on the large commercial coffee machine used by employees throughout the building. Grease marked the edges of his hands, and a folded shop rag rested in his back pocket. Claire slowed her steps as recognition settled in quietly. Marcus Reed looked up from the machine just long enough to acknowledge her presence with a polite nod before returning his attention to the loose wiring inside the panel. To him, she was simply another person passing through the lobby of a building where he had been called to repair equipment. He had no reason to believe the woman watching him for that brief moment was the same stranger who had shared his table days earlier, or that her name was written in silver letters on the top floor office above them. Claire stood there for a second longer before continuing toward the exit, a faint, thoughtful smile resting on her face. Sometimes the most important meetings did not happen in boardrooms or offices high above the city. Sometimes they happened quietly over a simple cup of coffee, when a man with oil on his hands chose kindness simply because his daughter was watching.